Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker, and thank you for watching A Healthcare Z. Today's topic is Dr. Robert Pearl, and his book, Uncaring. He examines, is doctor culture uncaring? Now, this has tremendous healthcare finance implications, which is why we are going to discuss his book today. And also, Dr. Pearl is one of the physicians that if we work in healthcare, we need to know who he is. And let me tell you why. He was the CEO of the Permanente medical group, which is the physician group for Kaiser Permanente, or KP, as they call it. And he was not only the CEO, he was the CEO there for 18 years, from 1999 to 2017. So he's only somewhat recently retired. And the Permanente Medical Group is the largest, it is the #1 largest physician medical group in America. It has 10,000 doctors. It has 38,000 allied health professionals, medical techs, clerks, etc., etc. Okay. It has 5 million members, mostly in California, but also in places like Washington State, and in Colorado, and in Georgia, and in the Washington, D.C. area. So it spans the country, it's huge, and he was there for a long time. So guess what? Dr. Pearl, who himself is a plastic surgeon, so he's practicing physician, he saw patients for a long time. Something tells me he probably knows a lot about doctors and doctor culture if he led a group of 10,000 doctors for 18 years. So let's hear what he has to say. Now, I'm immediately going to couch this in another book, which is going to probably make things a little confusing. And that is the book by Peter Drucker. I think it's appropriate, right? Everybody knows who Peter Drucker is. He's sort of the management guru from back in the 1950s, middle of the 20th century. So Peter Drucker, probably one of his most famous books, fantastic book, is The Effective Executive, where he talks about what makes executives effective and what makes them ineffective and how to become more effective, okay? And one of the points Dr. Drucker makes in his book is that at the end of the day, executives tend to be very high-functioning people. They tend to be very capable, okay? But that at the same time means that they also tend to have a lot of big problems. So he said, look, your typical person, they have peaks. In other words, they have aptitudes, things that they're good at, and they have valleys, and they have things that they are not good at, and they have blind spots, and they have problems, right? And he says in executives, that exact same phenomenon exists, but it's much more accentuated. In other words, executives have really high peaks. In other words, they have huge degrees of skill and competence in various areas, but they have even larger valleys to go along with those bigger peaks. So, for physicians, arguably they're highly capable people in general. So one might say, okay, well, what are the peaks of a physician? They tend to work incredibly hard. They tend to be very intelligent. They have tremendous dedication to their job and to their patients. They undergo tremendous sacrifice. Talk about all the things that have gone on with COVID-19 and coronavirus and how much physicians have sacrificed for the sake of the health, treating people with COVID. That's just one of a gazillion examples, right? Sleepless nights, long hours, many times away from their families, lots of worrying about their patients, okay? But physicians have deep valleys. And really the point of this book is about the valleys of physician culture, right? So my sort of paraphrasing of what this book is about is, hey, physicians have some valleys, and those valleys cause problems. And so if we're going to do things like improve healthcare, then physicians need to look at themselves, right? So the classic expression, right? If you point your finger at somebody else, you got 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. So if physicians are going to point their fingers at other entities, whether it be the government or insurance companies or hospital administrators, you name it, that physicians need to realize that they have 3 fingers pointing back at themselves in terms of problems or valleys that they have. And Dr. Pearl does something very brave where he confronts these valleys head on in a way that a retired CEO really can. I mean, to a certain extent, he's like set, right? Like he doesn't probably ever need to work another day in his life. So frankly, he can say a lot of things that in his mind are true and highly unpopular with his physician colleagues. And if you look at the Amazon reviews for Uncaring on Amazon, you will see a lot of physicians who write some pretty scathing things, but I think that's to be expected. That's not to say that this book is bad, but if you're going to write something about the shortcomings of physicians, you better believe that physicians are going to have an issue with that and see that negatively. Okay, but let's talk about these values. Okay, of course, what do we talk about here on A Healthcare Z all the time? That Dr. Pearl talks about over and over and over again in this book is how fee-for-service corrupts physician practice. Fee-for-service corrupts physician practice. Now, he refers to the alternative as prepayment, and when you want to call that capitation or value-based care, it is essentially the same idea that is proposed and supported by other physicians whose books I have also recently highlighted on A Healthcare Z, like Dr. Vivian Lee, like Dr. Marty McCary, like Dr. Atul Gawande, like the economist Dr. Uwe Reinhardt, who was from Princeton, passed away. But look, I mean, Dr. Lee is like the head doc over at Google. Dr. Marty McCary is a surgeon at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Atul Gawande is a surgeon at Brigham and Women's at Harvard, okay? And these are incredibly famous physicians, and they and Dr. Pearl are all saying the same thing in terms of how fee-for-service is not the way to go for physicians. Now, obviously, there are gobs and gobs of physicians that disagree with this and say that fee-for-service does not corrupt their ability to practice medicine. But I'm just saying that here we have another example of another physician who led 10,000 doctors for 18 years who says that fee-for-service is not the right way to go. Now, he also talks about a couple other values. Those other values are one, pride. He says, look, in not so many words, he said, look, physicians have a lot of pride. Now, one example that's rather interesting is that he is very detailed and articulate, and he has highly studied the issue of moral injury, which is where physicians claim that today's healthcare system and the government and health insurance companies and hospital administrators are inflicting moral injury on physicians. In other words, physicians are being forced to make decisions and do things that are causing them to burn out. And that is being done to them. In other words, physicians are the victims. And that they are the victims of moral injury caused them by the government, health insurance companies, hospital administrators. Okay, now he says, in no way, shape, or form, that look, for physicians to claim moral injury and yet ignore the fact that they themselves overtreat patients and they themselves cause not just moral injury, they cause physical injury to their patients. So for them to explain moral injury and yet not work to do something about the overtreatment and literal physical pain and even death that they cause patients is really pride. It's really physicians not looking at. It's only looking at the physician peaks and all the wonderful things they do and not looking at the valleys. Okay? Fine. Listen, at the end of the day, guess what? Physicians are human and pride is a common shortcoming of humans. Okay? Next up, greed. Okay, he says that, look, physicians take money and gifts. Now, when they take money, they take it in the form of like speaker fees and honorarium. I mean, it's all called all sorts of stuff. It's not literally a bribery payment, okay? But they get these fancy dinners, and yet they get it from pharmaceutical companies, they get it from medical device companies, and yet they don't expressly state their conflicts of interest with their patients all the time. I'm sure there are some physicians that do, and not only do they not state this conflict of interest, a lot of physicians even deny that these gifts or dinners or honoraria from pharmaceutical companies, they even deny that it in fact impacts their clinical care, where there is evidence in Dr. Pearl's opinion to the contrary. So, and again, he actually cites some of the same studies I've cited in previous A Healthcare Z videos. So again, greed, guess what that is? That's a human shortcoming, and doctors are human. So if anything, what I got when I was about physician culture and all the valleys from what Dr. Pearl was talking about, is that, hey, look, doctors are human. Okay. Arguably, to a certain extent, doctors themselves don't think they're human, and to a certain extent, like, patients and the public don't think they're human. But I think at the end of the day, it's much more realistic to say, like, look, doctors are human. And they have some really positive qualities, but they got some really negative qualities too, just like humans have. So I think that that's a very rational way to set the expectations for whether it be colleagues of physicians, physicians working with other physicians, or patients working with their physicians, is to say, look, they're human. We shouldn't expect them to be superhuman because they're not. And he actually ends the book, I think, in a very constructive way, where he says, look, physician culture is not going to change overnight. It's not going to change anytime soon. In fact, it might not even change at all. But there are 9 questions that patients need to ask their doctors to ensure that they get better care and, frankly, minimize or avoid these valleys or problems in physician culture. Things like, how much is this going to cost? Things that the Choosing Wisely campaign also suggests. Things like, have you washed your hands? Things like, is this test or procedure really necessary? Things like, is this safe? Now, I will actually list in the show note these 9 questions, and not all 9 questions are relevant for in every single patient interaction, but I think it's very interesting and I think very practical for Dr. Poole to say, hey, look, silence on the part of patients is of no value. Frankly, silence is dangerous. And I think that that's something that we've talked about previously on A Healthcare Z, and really something that all of us, whether we work in health insurance or employee benefits or HR or hospital finance or physicians, is that, look, one of the great tools that we can give our patients to ensure better quality care is to have them speak up and ask questions. And that's my point for today. Thank you for watching A Healthcare Z.